Before we get started, my friends, I just want to mention that there are quite a few optimizations you can do outside of the game as well for better performance. In this video right here, we're going to dive a little deeper into the graphics settings and the PostFX settings specifically. I did all the testing in a offline RAID since that gives me the most consistent results all around. Obviously, a online RAID is going to have a much bigger or a little bigger impact on your frames with each setting since it does include other players and scavs and so on and so forth. It includes AI. That being said, let's dive into the game tab settings. Now, diving into the game tab, everything here is pretty much personal preference. Obviously, this is your UI, your language, and so on and so forth. Automatic RAM cleaner, I have never used. I use one outside of the game. If you want to see what that is, check the other video like I mentioned. And only use physical cores. I have never noticed any sort of performance increase or decrease when I change this. So for me personally, I just do not tick them and I'll leave them off. Now, going to the graphics tab, obviously you should always use the native resolution of your monitor. So if you have a 1080p, use the 1920 by 1080. I have a 1440p, so this is my resolution. Screen mode, highly recommend full screen. I personally do use borderless just because I live stream, and when I alt tab out of a full screen game, my OBS sometimes does weird stuff. Now, VSync I do not use because I do use NVIDIA Reflex low latencies. And moving on to the textures, you have a choice between low, medium, and high. As you can see, the FPS difference is pretty significant, at least in an offline factory RAID. But honestly, this is completely down to what kind of PC you have. If you have at least 8 GB of VRAM, I think you should have no trouble getting away with medium or even turning it up to high. If you have less than 8 GB of VRAM, if you have like 6, maybe you can get away with medium. If you have less than 6, obviously you have to go with low. There's literally no other option for you, unfortunately. Moving on to shadows, as you can see, the FPS difference between low and ultra on factory is pretty considerable. Obviously, factory is a tiny map, so the FPS numbers are astronomical, but this was supposed to be more of a visual representation rather than what the FPS is like. Depending on your system, difference between low and ultra, maybe 10 to 15 frames. Testing in a offline woods raid, it was around 10 frames for me personally. This obviously changes with the weather conditions alone, since you will be rendering more shadows on a sunny day rather than a rainy day, for example. From a visibility standpoint, I would turn the shadows to low. Turning this up makes the shadows more defined and better looking, but increasing it might also add more shadows and make the existing ones even bigger. And also, while we are on the topic of shadows, let's take a look at grass shadows. Turning this option on definitely makes the grass pop out more. And in case you forgot what grass looks like, here is the comparison between grass shadows on and off on both low and ultra settings. If you look at the top right of each image, you can see that the frame rate drops are not that high, and it is barely noticeable on the low shadows. So this is completely personal preference on how you would like your ground to look. Personally, I like the way it looks while off, but if you wish to turn this on, you should not be losing too many frames. But obviously, if you are on a super low-end PC, you might want to just turn this off and get yourself a couple of extra frames. But moving on from shadows, we get to object LOD quality. Now, there is a pretty considerable FPS impact between 2 and 4. The sweet spot for this, in my humble opinion, is 2.5. You don't really need to go to 3. Reason being, you don't really see that far into the distance for where it would make an impact. There are very few areas where you would see that kind of distance, where it would make an impact. What it does do, though, is some objects in the distance, they kind of like, they render, but they half render. They don't render all the way. It just looks just like a blurry mess, and it doesn't look very good. So increasing the LOD quality to 2.5 instead of having it on 2, that eliminates that problem, and I think that's the sweet spot for it. LOD quality also affects the gear you see on the ground, like backpacks, rigs, helmets, stuff like that. And as you can see in the video here, that stuff disappears, but if you increase it to 2.5, you will see it from a little further distance away. Only exception is the helmets. The helmets have their own some sort of logic behind them, and you can see them from a much farther distance away. So increasing this to 2.5 will increase that distance even more. And this also includes the gear that the players are wearing. So sometimes you might see a player in a distance that they don't have a helmet, but when you scope in, they actually do have a helmet. So increasing that to 2.5 eliminates that little sudden graphical change when you scope in. It makes it more immersive, I suppose. I highly recommend it on 2.5. And also, while we're talking about scopes, whatever this setting here is it 4, is it 2, it doesn't seem to matter for the scopes. The scopes seem to have their own LOD quality. So every time you scope in, you will see the exact same thing everyone else sees in the game. So the backpacks on the ground at a distance, objects in the distance, and so on and so forth. So it really shouldn't matter on the scope side of things, but just for the visual standpoint, 2.5 is perfect. Now, overall visibility is definitely one of those that you do not want to have on the lowest setting, no matter what PC you have. It doesn't seem to have almost any impact on your FPS. Obviously, if you have a low-end PC going from 400 to 3000, you're gonna have a difference in FPS, but at minimum, you should have it at 1000, because if you look at the video here on 400, if you're looking from left to right, some areas are not loaded in, they kind of disappear and reappear, and it just looks terrible. If you move it up to 1000, most of it is eliminated. Small details may appear and or disappear and reappear. It doesn't look very good. That's why my sweet spot is the 1500 overall visibility. Most of the stuff is always there. If something does disappear and reappear, it's usually something very insignificant that I don't really notice anyway. So keep that in mind. Overall visibility, I would recommend at the minimum, no matter what kind of PC you have, at least 1000. But moving on to anti-aliasing, now we're gonna have to turn DLSS off really quickly here. The quality difference between off and FXAA is not that great. I think FXAA, obviously it makes some areas a little more smoother, but in general, FXAA looks kind of trash. If you're gonna use anti-aliasing, use TAA. Compared to off, it takes like 6 FPS for me when I was testing, but it looks much better. The quality is much higher. For those 3 extra frames, I'm willing to sacrifice them just to get a little bit of a smoother picture. But the difference between TAA high and the regular TAA, honestly, I can't even really tell what the difference is. If you're gonna use anti-aliasing, highly recommend just use the TAA. Resampling, I would pretty much never touch this. Just leave it at 1x off. Unless you're playing on a smart fridge, maybe you want to try downsampling. But for that, I'd rather use the AMD FSR. You'll probably have a better experience overall. What I do want to mention though is a couple people have mentioned that if they have a RTX 40 series card and they're struggling with frame rate, turning this up to 2x super sampling has increased their frame rate actually. It sounds kind of backwards, but it makes sense because it takes more workload off of your CPU and puts it on your GPU. So if you are a 40 series card owner and you think you should have more frames, give super sampling a try. And moving on to NVIDIA DLSS, I don't know if I mentioned, but I personally don't use anti-aliasing since I do use NVIDIA DLSS, and that automatically turns resampling and anti-aliasing off. You do need a RTX series card to have the option for NVIDIA DLSS, and if you do use it, highly recommend use it on quality. Don't go with balance, don't go with performance. It just looks absolute garbage. Go with quality. It looks a little bit washed, but you can counter it with sharpness and PostFX as well. I personally use it on quality because I am streaming and I'm recording and I could use the extra frames. When it comes to FSR 1.0, you can only use it if you turn on the TAA. I straight up just recommend you don't use the FSR 1.0. Turn off the anti-aliasing and go straight to FSR 2.2. The highest setting is quality here, and compared to the FSR 1.0's highest quality, 2.2 is much better. The frame rate is exactly the same or pretty much the same. So if you are going to go with the AMD FSR, go with the 2.2 and use quality. And once again, everything down here is kind of washed and not recommended. Only use it as a last resort. And also, it is worth mentioning that you can use the NVIDIA graphics cards with the AMD FSR as well. I personally used GTX 1070 and I used the FSR 1.0 because FSR 2.2 wasn't in the game back then. So just because there's an AMD in the name doesn't mean that you can use an NVIDIA card. So keep that in mind. If you need a bit of frames and you do not have the RTX series card, you can try and use the FSR 2.2 as well. Moving on to the HBAO. Now this has pretty noticeable FPS impact even on the max performance, which is the lowest setting right here, as you can see. It obviously gets worse between every single setting, and colored ultra, which is the highest setting, takes about 40 to 50 FPS for me, which is pretty crazy actually. So definitely do not recommend going past at least high performance. But from a competitive standpoint, you are a little better turning it off because it does make darker areas a little darker. It makes the shadows a little darker. I personally use it because it makes your gun shadows and your gloves and stuff like that look a little better. So from a competitive standpoint, turn it off. If you want a little bit of an eye candy, so to speak, on your gun and your hands and just your player model, you can try and turn it on to max performance. But FPS impact is pretty significant. If you don't have the FPS to spare in the first place, don't worry about it, just turn it off. And same thing with SSR. If you don't have the frames to spare, just turn it off. The thing with SSR is that even with the low setting, you're taking around 10 FPS impact, but the reflection on like a lake and stuff, it looks super low detailed. It is honestly looking terrible. Unless you're gonna run at least medium or high, I highly recommend just turning it off. That being said, it does give you a little bit of a visibility boost in darker areas. It basically counteracts the HBAO's effect on making darker areas slightly darker. You turn on SSR, even on the low setting, it does improve visibility in the dark areas. But if you don't have the FPS to spare, turn it off. If you have a higher end PC, at least medium is recommended by me. Now, anisotropic filtering is a bit of a weird one. I feel like it doesn't work in certain maps, or at least not working to an extent that it should. So technically what this does, it makes angled textures or angled areas more detailed. So for example, big rocks on woods, it adds more textures or more detail to it. As you know, rock formations have all kinds of different angles and so on. It adds bits of snow on the sides and just makes it more detailed, like I said. But for some reason, it doesn't seem to work on custom. Only thing it does is add like 6 blades of grass at a distance, but like all the rock formations or like the sides of rock, they don't get higher textures compared to woods. Nothing changes. So my recommendation is turning it off. For the longest time, I had it on per texture because I thought it made my game look better, but it turns out it's not really that much of a difference. And even the changes on woods, you don't really notice it. You don't really look at rocks while you're moving around. You're usually keeping your eyes on a open area looking for the enemy. So considering this takes about 10 to 15 frames on and 5 to 10 on per texture, it is just not worth spending the frame rate in my opinion. And moving on to the NVIDIA Reflex low latency. Now this was broken for the longest time, but it seems to be fixed now. So just to unlock my FPS, I'm using on plus boost. It reduces some of the rendering lag. It doesn't really have any impact on FPS though, from my experience, maybe on the lower system. I'm gonna put my DLSS to quality, and now we're getting to the sharpness. Sharpness has it basically has no effect on your FPS at all. Maybe 1 frame per second, but really nothing significant. I prefer it on 0.9. This is completely personal preference. Make sure you try it out yourself in the raid and see what looks the best for you. Everything down here, just switch it off. High quality color, I don't really see much of a difference. Plus it takes a couple of frames. That's not worth it. Z-blur, I have no idea what that does. I'm pretty sure it used to give you like a depth of field effect on your gun. Doesn't work anymore for some reason. Chromatic aberrations and noise, just turn them off. Don't really need them. But Streets of Tarkov lower texture resolution mode, turn that on, makes the game a lot smoother on Streets, of course. All right, and we have arrived at Interchange. It's one of the best maps in my opinion to check out or test out your PostFX, because there's a bit of dark, there's a bit of light, so on and so forth. So let's enable PostFX. Before I start changing anything, I just want to mention that clarity is one of the ones that eats your FPS. We have 149 right now. I'll turn it up to 1 and it'll drop down 15-ish frames. It doesn't matter if it's 1 or if it's 100. The amount of FPS is literally the same. So keep that in mind. And same with adaptive sharpen. Doesn't matter if it's 1 or 100. It usually takes around 12, 13, 14 frames as well. Color grading also takes a touch of your frames, but it's usually 2-3 frames. Nothing too major. And it does make your game look a whole lot better as well. So let's move on to brightness. Let's go top to bottom. I personally like brightness at 50. It makes some of these darker areas slightly brighter. At least it makes it easier to make out what you're looking at in the darker areas. Obviously, it's nothing too major. The downside is that the flashlights are going to be brighter in your face. And also currently with the snow, while you're using NVGs on let's say on a moonlit night, the snow can really start hurting your eyes a bit. Obviously, it depends on your monitor settings and your NVIDIA or AMD settings, whatever. Those matter as well. But if you do use these settings and you find NVGs at night are hurting your eyes, turn down the brightness a bit. I personally run 50 though. I'll suffer through it. Now, saturation literally just changes the color of your surroundings. As you can see, it's super colorful. And this is borderline black and white. I turn it up to 25. I do have digital vibrance turned up a bit as well, and we are going to use colorfulness as well. Now, even though clarity takes 15 frames away from me, I cannot go without it. So I turn it up to 100. So just by looking at the floor here, you can see the detail that comes out when I just increase this, and it makes some of the shadows more sharper as well. So I am willing to take the FPS hit. If you don't have the frames, obviously, skip over it, leave it to 0, and don't worry about it one bit. Colorfulness, I'll turn it up to 60. It makes the game even more colorful. I kind of like it. I feel like this is the main setting that really makes my sunsets and sunrises super orange, which kind of sucks, not gonna lie, but I do like it the way it looks when it's not a sunrise or sunset. So I'm keeping mine at 60. I've always played at 60, and I'll keep it there for now as well. Moving on to Luma Sharpen. Doesn't really affect your FPS. Just makes everything a touch more sharper. Really can use it with the DLSS as well. I like it. Adaptive Sharpen, I do not use it. It does make things sharper, obviously, but as you can see here, like things are kind of blocky, and it like brings that out even more. I guess this Sharpen kind of does the same, but not as much. So Adaptive Sharpen, not my thing personally, so I will keep my frame rate. Now, color grading, this is obviously personal preference. There are many options here, what kind of color you want. I personally use Clifton, if I can find it right here. It makes the darker areas stand out more for me personally, I feel like. So I use it at 65. And if you look here, like some of these areas just look a little better, or like more stand out-ish, I guess. I don't even know what the word is, but you can see what it does. It just makes it look a little better in my opinion. I do use the colorblind mode Tritanopia as well. I'm not colorblind, but I just like the way it looks. It makes stuff slightly more clearer in certain areas, like this wall here comes out a little bit more. And this is what it looks like with all the PostFX settings off. And this is what it looks like with on. So obviously a massive difference.